from the Mercy One studio.
Support for Iowa Catholic Radio and Making It Personal is provided by Sarah Vocations Ministry. Learn more at joinserra.org.
Making It Personal with Bishop William Joensen on Iowa Catholic Radio and iowacatholicradio.com.
Welcome to Making It Personal with Bishop Joensen. I'm Kelly Mesher-Collins with the Diocese of Des Moines. On today's show, we'll be visiting with Jonathan Pageau, French-Canadian iconographer and editor for the Orthodox Arts Journal. We'll also be visiting with him about a number of subjects, and he was recently featured on the Catholic streaming site Formed. But before we get to today's interview, let's find out what's on the Bishop's mind.
We are so blessed. Kelly, 2 shows in a row. We're starting a new tradition here. It's so good to have you. So
Thank you.
Marvelous. And all is right with the world as we move further into almost approaching May, and the cusp of May. I was happy to be with the St. John's Norwalk, Confirmandi on Monday, and then St. Patrick's in Dunlap. So we're moving around the diocese. Tomorrow we'll be with Corpus Christi and Council Bluffs.
I recently saw photos you were in Granger. My niece was confirmed.
What a great community up there. Yeah. That was really a lively exchange. And then shout out to our home colleague, Father Ambrose Jean Ledoux, celebrating his silver anniversary with Mass on Saturday night at the Cathedral, and then a celebration afterwards. So it's going to have a nice ethnic diversity in the music, some of the Africans and other people. So I get to just come and pray and praise God. It's going to be a beautiful thing as well. And then continuing on Sunday also, and I get to confirm my niece, Olivia, at St. Luke's.
Very exciting.
So I'll try not to embarrass you too much, Olivia, but the things that we're saying there. So we're looking forward to this kind of engagement with Jonathan Pageau, and what he's all about. This whole theme of beauty, that the power of the good has taken refuge in the nature of the beautiful. And obviously Bishop Barron really thinks that beauty is the way that the church will evangelize. If we're not awakening people, that we will have no hope to drawing them into communion with us in the church. And so I think Monsieur Pageau will give us a nice little piece on that as well. Kelly, lots going on in the Catholic world, and the Pope, he was getting kind of lonely, I guess, huh?
He was. The pandemic, he missed the crowd, so he is very excited that they have allowed people to return to the gatherings on Sunday when he does his opening prayer. He said he was very excited and he missed people, and he has been doing his noon prayer out the window, which people have been to Rome.
The Angelus prayer.
Yes. Yeah, and so he was very excited, said praise be God. He was very happy to see people out in the
he's such the shepherd's heart and such a gregarious extrovert, I think, not only does he enliven us and bring us the joy of the gospel, but we have to know that, that's the spirit for him too, to strengthen him in his ministry as well, and how that's there. Even with the precautions, our Roman seminaries are talking about, they have conditions orange and yellow and red and everything else. So they must have been relaxing that also in that way. And then, we think about, we don't regard our partnership as Beauty and the Beast, but that's not far from it sometimes. But some of the support, which first when the fire happened, there were those who were coming forward with the big bucks, but now I haven't necessarily followed through on that. But now they have a unique fundraiser, I understand.
Yes, there was a news story on Catholic News Service talking about how you can sponsor a gargoyle. They are looking to raise money for, of course, everyone's familiar with the big fire at Notre Dame a couple years ago in France, in Paris. And so they are working to raise money. They have over $1 billion to raise, I believe. It's going to take 10 years to rebuild, but you can get involved by sponsoring a gargoyle.
Will they name it after us?
Capacity.
I think, some of the facial expressions I have when I'm riding the bike, and there's a pickup truck going by, that kind of angry, contorted look, and writhing in pain, as the water pours through that mouth. What a metaphor for those who, the word drinks through them, the Spirit passes through them, but they are not themselves satiated in any way. They are place themselves over the word. I think I wouldn't be surprised if the Monsieur Pageau gives us a little bit of that too. That the way in which some of our culture has seen itself as beyond religion, post faith world in that way, but that irrepressible human spirit. And so the gargoyle that might be sponsored, that I don't know if one claims proprietary right over that also, but...
they don't give a lot of details, but I'm sure if you look up the Notre Dame, you'd find some information. Okay, all right, kind of a rogues gallery in which some of us might take their place as well. But so, we're looking for that spark, and I think that spark that our guest speaker is going to be able to speak to us, that beauty will enthuse us for work, and work is to raise us up. That's right. We'll be right back. You're listening to Making It Personal with Bishop Joensen on Iowa Catholic Radio and Spirit Catholic Radio Network. Welcome back. You're listening to Making It Personal with Bishop Joensen. On today's show, we're visiting with Jonathan Pageau, French-Canadian iconographer and editor of the Orthodox Journal, an online journal devoted to Orthodox arts of scholars, musicians, designers, artisans, and iconographers from North America and Europe. Jonathan is also featured in the new series The Search, now streaming on the Catholic streaming site Formed.
Well, Mr. Pageau, thank you for making time with us. And this is kind of opening up for me a whole new treasure trove of spirituality and scholarship and beauty and all that's here, and in multiple forms of the media that you work with as an artist as well. So just, it's called Making It Personal. Could you just share a little bit about how you've arrived at this point in your life and really are reaching out, not only through media, but you work with a number of people. Your artistry, did that kind of, become an expression of your spirituality, or did your spirituality emerge more from the artistry in your life path, or how did those two coincide?
Well, I grew up here in Quebec, which is a French-speaking part of Canada, and it actually used to be considered the most Catholic place in the world, in the early century. Mm-hmm. But just like everywhere else in the 1960s, there was a massive change, and my parents converted from Catholicism to Protestantism, and I actually grew up with my father being a Baptist pastor. And so I was interested as a young man in art. I always kind of knew I was going to be an artist, but there was a underlying tension, let's say, in terms of visual art and the Protestant tradition, also because a lot of the people were newly converts. They were very excited and very, how can I say this, not my own family, but just around me, kind of anti-liturgical attitude, very kind of evangelical. So
not blatant iconoclasm, but not far from
but
it
almost.
either.
I would say, very close to blatant iconoclasm. And so when I came into college, all of this brought me into a spiritual crisis, I would say, because I was experimenting several problems. One was trying to be authentic about the question of being an evangelical and making art, and that was a massive struggle, trying to meant, and at the same time being a Christian and being a contemporary artist as well, because contemporary art is very cynical, it's very, there's a lot of irony involved in it, it's like a comment upon a comment upon a comment, and I was really looking for
I've
something.
sometimes, and hopefully not too pejorative, I'm showing my own sensibilities here, but as I go to contemporary art museums on occasion, whether abroad or here, it seems cleverness rather than artistry sometimes prevail. Is that too harsh?
No, you're absolutely right. I would say that especially now, as we move forward, it seems like the contemporary art has been reduced to a punchline, where you get it, and then it's funny, it's clever, and then you move on. And so I was really searching for something more authentic, something more integrated. And so I kind of almost made up a symbolic language of references to scripture and to history, and was trying to play with that in terms of my painting, but I wasn't really making it work. I finished first in my class, but my professor, who was kind of guiding my bachelor's degree, at the very end of my studies, like the last evaluation, basically said, "Don't worry, you're getting an A, you're fine, but what are you doing here? You don't belong here." She said, you should go to seminary or something. And, so in my early 20s,
you are an alien, exile.
Yeah, exactly. But in my early 20s, I was so cocky, it just kind of rolled off my back. But I realize now, and after some time, that she was absolutely right, that she really understood the problem. And so all of this really, in terms of, there were other things going on in terms of a spiritual crisis, a kind of search for more depth, reading philosophy, getting, learning about postmodern philosophy as well, being, let's say, faced with where the state of philosophy was, in your 20s, your whole mind kind of opens up. And I would say that through that search, it all led me towards the Church Fathers, and then ultimately towards medieval art, which I discovered and fell in love with, because I realized that the Christian Church had developed a universal language of art that was this very powerful symbolic language, a very powerful sacred language, which also reference, which also was involved in it wasn't visual. There was also a reference to scripture, but also reference to architecture, and this was also in the hymns. And so there was like this massive symphonic dance of references that were developed within the church. And all of that.
Might I interject here, because you piqued my curiosity, that you speak of delving into philosophy, which is also a kind of precarious venture. I mean, if we look at structuralism, post-structuralism, or all that, Derrida and others, that could lead us into the valley of darkness, right, from which we may or may not emerge. But were there any particular philosophers that helped you kind of be drawn then to the kind of Christian intellectual tradition in that?
Yeah, it's very strange, but it was actually Derrida who sparked me. I read a text by Derrida called Sauf le nom, Save the Name. Mm-hmm. I read a lot of Derrida in college, but then he wrote a text on negative theology. Mm-hmm. And it was a reading of Silesius's Cherubic Wanderer. And I had never heard of negative theology. Like in the evangelical tradition, it just doesn't exist. And so this short little text of his really sparked me, and made me very curious. And so I started to read apophatic theology and negative theology and realized that, I think Derrida was getting it wrong, but at least he opened up a strange door for me. And then I ended up reading St. Dionysius the Areopagite and St. Gregory of Nyssa, and just falling in love with like St. Maximus the Confessor. I just really discovered a Christian metaphysics which was both apophatic. There's one quote in Derrida which was funny. He said, we need to develop a theology that's not just neither nor, which is apophatic theology, but is also and right, this and that. Mm-hmm. And that really struck me as a way of thinking, and I feel like that's what I discovered in St. Maximus, for example, where there's both an apophatic and a cataphatic move in their writing. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so all of that
which and apophatic, that which kind of transcends any kind of thematic, conceptual delivery of meaning, but is nonetheless a positive, not just a cancellation or a void, if you will. And that cataphatic, that kind of discursive way in which we engage God. Is that fair to kind of characterize those in those terms for our listeners? Some of whom may get it, and some of them may not.
Those terms are not obvious.
This is not a graduate seminar. So
exactly.
We're already at 35,000 feet. The seatbelt light is off. You're welcome to move around the cabin here. So.
Well, let's say a good
you read it in my face.
An easy way to say it would be something for me like that God is beyond all categories, that God is beyond all description, that God is beyond any way you can, even being itself. But at the same time, God is the root of everything that exists. And so you can actually, everything in the world is insufficient to speak of God, but everything in the world speaks of God necessarily because it has its root in God. Mm. So I would say that those two extremes kind of filled up, and then obviously, the summit of that being the incarnation and the amazing story of Christ. All of that and the art and the liturgy and all of this is what finally led me to Orthodoxy, because I really did fall in love with medieval art in particular because I felt it had the most cohesive and the most coherent language of references. But I felt like it had been lost in the West, that kind of grand symphonic dance, I would call it. And then when I discovered iconography and realized that tradition was still alive in the Orthodox faith. That kind of cinched it for me. And then I studied, and when I walked into an Orthodox church, it was during Lent, a service called the Pre-Sanctified Liturgy, which is a very penitential service. It's in the evening, and it has a kind of somber tone to it. And I just knew that this was going to be my home.
Was there a singular religious experience in the midst of this kind of symphonic dance in which you were drawn into, or was that a kind of a ecstatic moment, if you will, or just a series of things that was drawing in an organic way? Yeah.
It's hard because it's one of these things when you say it doesn't sound. I was reading a text by Vladimir Losky, who's a modern, like a 20th century Orthodox theologian. It's called Tradition and Traditions. And he was basically laying out the structure of reality, from the notion of silence into the notion of scripture through the idea of word. But it was a very technical text in terms of the way it was written, but I was crying because I felt like he was telling me that Christianity wasn't just this story overlay, which you put over a kind of materialist framework, which is what I kind of grew up with, which is that, we're materialists and, we believe in all these kind of materialist ways of thinking the world. And on top of that, we overlay this strange story about sacrifice and some guy dying on a cross. But discovering
much for atonement theology. Okay.
And so, but discovering just how deeply, how deeply the story of Christianity was a worldview, you could say, that I could enter into and that I could live in this worldview, and that it told me as much about my own personal salvation as it did about how reality actually unfolds, how the divine manifests itself into the world in specific ways. And so that when I read that text, I was like, okay, for sure I'm going here. I'm going in this direction. And then walking into a church during a service and seeing it, all of it embodied in terms of this dance that I talk about, now seeing it in practice with the icons on the wall and the candles, and then, these beautiful texts that are sung in chant. I thought, okay, this is it. This is where I need to go.
Okay. You're holding up to us, our listeners, a kind of Catholic ethos, an aesthetic, a Christian ethos that might be present in this way, and how Orthodoxy continues to embody this, if you will, then the aesthetic dimension. Dostoevsky's comment, the world will be saved by beauty, and what's more beautiful than love, which, Dorothy Day, a familiar figure for many of us in the Catholic worker movement, but those who don't believe in God, they believe in love. And so how beauty has this kind of evangelical, attractive, magnetic force, that God is not unapproachable, but God in the incarnation manifests himself. As one who has some awareness, and probably more for myself, quite honestly, the Ukrainian Greek Catholic, but would you say that there are different spiritualities and hence different artistries, even distinguished, even if they're united ultimately among Orthodoxy? Do you get different accents there?
I mean, within the Orthodox Church? Well,
yes.
Yeah, there's definitely
in the plays out in the artistic realm as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think for sure Orthodoxy for sure really is Trinitarian in everywhere. Like it has such a Trinitarian basis, and it kind of celebrates this within its life, that it has this balance. It's an organic balance, but this organic balance between the particular and the universal. And so what you end up having is both a deep, deep unity and a deep sense of participation in one story, but at the same time, this normal overflowing into, whether it's a Russian church or a Greek church or a Georgian church, and the kind of flavors of the local world will appear, and different emphasis will obviously appear within the life of the church. And so there really is this beautiful encounter between this unitive tradition and then, the particulars of the language of the people, and then the folk cultures, which kind of taint, or not taint in a bad way, but let's say give a color or a flavor to the tradition. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. So iconography, and you yourself, thinking again, and you mentioned the Eastern Fathers, but the traditional icon that many of us in America or in the West would think about, the kind of two-dimensional flat painting. But for you, iconography includes the kind of bas-relief of early Christianity as well, and so hence the media both of painting and carving very much at the heart of your artistic endeavors. Could you play those off a little bit, and how carving and imagery there, that three-dimensional, is properly an icon? Yeah.
Well, in the Orthodox tradition, it's hard to totally understand it, why statuary, for example, didn't take form. Some people have different theories about that, but for certain, the bas-relief was something that was lively within the medieval Byzantine tradition. It kind of went away a little bit after the fall of Constantinople, I would say. And there was some controversy in Russia, but it's a very historically particular thing that happened. And right now, in the 20th century, there was what we call a revival of iconography, where, having the tradition having almost been evacuated by modernism, by secularism, was really revived in its intellectual sense, but also its practice. And so the first wave in the 1950s and 60s and 70s were these kind of new iconographers that were coming out of Greece and of Russia. And now I would say in the past 20 years, now there's a second wave, which is the secondary arts of the Orthodox Church, which include things like embroidery, mosaic, and carving. And so I'm really part of that rediscovery of the ancient carving tradition of the church, both in stone and in wood. And so I feel very fortunate that I have a chance to kind of to participate in this reawakening or this revival of liturgical art.
And of course, not to try and be an apologist, but that how this is still present in the West. You said something of the falling away in the medieval and Renaissance era, but are there artists who capture that as well? We are moving toward our break. If you'll be willing to stay with us, Mr. Pageau, we'll come back with you and kind of maybe elaborate a few further topics here.
Certainly.
You're listening to Making It Personal with Bishop Joensen on Iowa Catholic Radio and the Spirit Catholic Radio. And we'll be back in a few minutes with Jonathan Pageau, French-Canadian iconographer and editor of Orthodox Arts Journal. We are back with Jonathan Pageau, French-Canadian iconographer, and much more. And we're back with Bishop Joensen.
Thank you for remaining with us. And, now in the wake of COVID, obviously you're mentoring of artists and the carving and writing of icons and things and the amount of time that might be there. But now touching people that you may not have direct personal contact with, but through social media, YouTube channels, other things like that. Can you speak to that and what sort of phenomena are you seeing here?
Well, in the past few years, I find myself in a strange position, which is that I started making YouTube videos for reasons that are maybe a little too complicated to explain, but I found myself with a strange following of a mix of atheists, just kind of post-Christian types, even neo-pagans and even New Age type people. And now I find myself with a strange audience of about, 100,000 people following me on YouTube.
Wow.
And half of them are not Christian. And I've realized that right now as the kind of scientism or the new atheist moment fades away, and as we see religion reappear on the horizon, in terms of the protests, in terms of this desire for a kind of religious fervor, like we saw in the George Floyd protest, was this kind of desire for something religious, and it's not completely understood and it's not completely rational, but there is a sense that people are looking for things to unite them and realizing that society is kind of fragmenting, and we need stories, we need figures to unite us, let's say. And so
that's interesting. I'm going to want to, and I'm not going to dwell on it too long, but that you would see a fundamental religious impulse in that, whether it's the call for justice, the desire for unity, but met at the same time, sometimes even embedded within the Black liberation movement, Black Lives Matter, a kind of Marxist disavowal of that. So please continue, but that's something that really is going to occupy me, I think, as I reflect.
Yeah, but I think the Marxist move is a religious move, ultimately. It's a strange kind of a strange deformed. A lot of the things we're seeing are deformed desires for religion, and whether it be these kind of massive social movements that end up having a mythological framework, whether it is people who are obsessed with Star Wars or with Harry Potter and want to kind of live in those worlds, besides the fact that we can't. There's this desire for participation and a desire for finding places where we can join together in a story. And what I've been trying to speak into is that desire and trying to help people, first of all, see that this is what religion is, and we have to be deliberate about it, or else it's going to come back and it's going to surprise us in all kinds of ways. So, for example, the scapegoating mechanism that we've seen happen, whether it is thinking that Trump is the reason for all the problems of reality, or whether it is thinking that this or that character, if we could just get rid of them, then everything would be fine. This scapegoat mechanism, this is a religious mechanism, and it culminates in the cross, like it culminates into the sacrifice of Christ. But so people are kind of they're looking for something. They're searching for this way to find unity within our fragmented society. And so I've been speaking into that in all kinds of ways, just helping people see it in movies, see it in different cultural manifestation, but then going back and helping people see the patterns that are in Scripture and the grand narrative that we find, from Genesis to Revelation, from the garden to the city, this whole massive story that we find, and helping people see how this is a story we can live in, that this is actually a balanced story that we can exist in. and it's found strange resonance. And like I said, you'll find atheists who tell me, I've been listening to you for 2 years, and you think, wow. And then they say, finally, I understand what you're talking about. And people, these strange figures, these strange kind of neo-pagans end up on the doorsteps of churches. And so it's a very
I
kind
think
of an
you put your finger on something that is very key for all of us, and whether we are in the church or in any way, whether you see yourself as a kind of surreptitious evangelist, but holding up true religion and what this ultimate impulse, and of course it has to acknowledge there's truth. We are unfortunately winding down, which means we're going to have to invite you back sometime. But I thank you so much for your time today. This is absolutely fascinating.
That's my pleasure.
Thank you, Jonathan. This has been another edition of Making It Personal with Bishop Joensen. Thank you to our guests and all of our listeners in Iowa, Nebraska, and Wisconsin on Iowa Catholic Radio and the Spirit Catholic Radio Network.
You can hear Making It Personal with Bishop William Joensen every week on Iowa Catholic Radio and iowacatholicradio.com.
Support for Iowa Catholic Radio and Making It Personal is provided by Sarah Vocations Ministry. Learn more at joinserra.org.